Welcome everyone to this presentation on examples of the self-thinning principle. As a quick review, self-thinning refers to the mortality that occurs in a turf population when plants grow in size. Mathematically, we can express self-thinning with this equation, where W is the mean weight of the individuals, C is a constant, and N is the density of plants. If we were to graph the equation, we would take a log of the weight and density, which results in a straight line with a negative 3:2 slope. The yellow line represents the self-thinning line. We can describe the area under the line as a point where we are below full canopy and no competition occurs among the individual plants. The yellow line represents full canopy, or in other words, the carrying capacity of the system. In the thinning or dying of plants as you move right to left on the line is known as the -3:2 slope power rule. Let's look at two seeding rate examples, which might help you visualize this graph that we saw in the previous presentation. Winter overseeding is the practice of overseeding a warm season turf grass like Bermuda grass with a cool season turf grass that will provide color to the Bermuda grass turf as it enters dormancy in the fall. This photograph shows a recently overseeded Bermuda grass turf that was overseeded with perennial ryegrass. The perennial ryegrass is the dark green color found on the fairway in green, and the non-overseeded Bermuda grass, which is entering winter dormancy, is a lighter colored turf. The second part or half of winter overseeding is that when spring arrives and the Bermuda grass begins to green up and grow, you would like the perennial ryegrass, in this case to be transitioned out, or in other words leave, so the Bermuda grass can grow in a healthy manner. We did a study in class a number of years ago where we overseeded Bermuda grass that was being maintained at our research facility here in Columbus, Ohio, with a variety of cool season turf grasses at various seeding rates. This table shows the rates of perennial ryegrass that we applied. After overseeding the previous fall, we evaluated our plots for percent Bermuda grass that was present. The higher the percentage of Bermuda grass, the more successful the transition. Now, Columbus, Ohio is not adapted for Bermuda grass, but it is for perennial ryegrass, so 100% transition would not likely occur. But the data did show the importance of seeding rate on spring transition. The relatively lower seeding rates of perennial ryegrass had considerably more perennial ryegrass hanging around in the summer than the higher seeding rate. Why? Most likely at the lower seeding rate, the perennial ryegrass developed into rather large hardy plants, less likely to transition. In contrast, the higher seeding rates of perennial ryegrass resulted in a greater percentage of Bermuda grass, a result of the more juvenile crowding perennial ryegrass plants that became more susceptible to environmental or management practices that would negatively affect them in the spring. In this example, we're going to look at seeding rates for creeping bentgrass. In studies conducted by Dr. Frank Rossi at Cornell University, he established creeping bentgrass cultivars at various seeding rates. I have just taken a small sample of data from his study. Pencross creeping bentgrass is considered to be a more coarse textured bentgrass or cultivar compared to some of the more improved creeping bentgrass cultivars that have been released recently. Given that creeping bentgrass seeding rates normally is around 1 to 1.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet, you can see that Pencross is relatively coarse texture-wise compared to the improved cultivar Crenshaw at seeding rates of 1/2 to 2 pounds. However, when you more than double the seeding rate, in this case to 4 pounds, the texture of Pencross is much finer, and as well as the Crenshaw. Relatively speaking, do you know where you are on the self-thinning line in comparing these various seeding rates? Dr. Rossi also observed disease occurrence, in this case dollar spot, on his research area. Notice the amount of disease that occurred at the high seeding rate compared to the lower ones, and this was 1 year after seeding. Again, remembering back to the self-thinning line, when you are at a greater shoot density, which is an indication of a finer leaf texture, the likelihood of disease is greater. Dr. Rossi also measured root weights across his cultivars at various depths. What he found was, in the upper 2 inches, the higher seeding rate had slightly more root mass than the lower seeding rate. However, at the 4 to 8 inch depth, the root mass was greater in the lower seeding rate, reflecting a more developed and tolerant plant to environmental stresses than a cultivars established at the higher rate, where its vast production, or most of its root production and stem production, was near the surface. Let's look at mowing. As a quick review, if we have a turf at full canopy or its carrying capacity, increasing the height of cut will move the population toward larger but fewer individuals. When we drop the height of cut, the opposite occurs. We increase density, but at the expense of the overall development of an individual. Although different turfgrass species, you can see the impact that mowing height has on the texture and plant development across the various heights of cut shown here. Could you rough out approximately where the 4 different heights of cut might occur in relation to each other on the self-thinning line? At higher heights, you see a lower density but a more developed plant than a lower height of cut, as shown here in this picture. I would mention, if you mow below a tolerant range of the turf, it could lead to the turf population falling below the self-thinning line into an area where plant competition is not occurring. In this situation, voids can occur. I put this photo in from the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. Overgrazing by farm animals, which is similar to mowing, leads to voids and open areas in the grassland areas, which resulted in sand, soil, and dust being lifted up by the winds and carried over large distances, obviously shown here a large dust storm. Our last example is with nitrogen. Nitrogen contributes to the growth and development of turf grasses. Incremental increases below the self-thinning line push the plant population toward full cover. Incremental increases beyond the optimum can shift the community down the yellow line or self-thinning line, and conversely, not enough nitrogen may move the community up the line or drop the population below the self-thinning line. This golf course fairway looks to be at full cover, but if you look closely, you can see dark green patches, which are patches of white clover. In this case, the turf was low or starved of nitrogen, resulting in gaps where the white clover established. So in this case, we were probably below that self-thinning line for this creeping bentgrass fairway. This is an interesting photograph taken during early spring, where the arrow, where is that arrow? There it is. Where that arrow is pointing, the turf is just coming out of dormancy. It looks coarse, has relatively low density, but is still at full cover. Now where the arrow is pointing, a dog has urinated in this area, causing spots of dark green grass and growth, and notice the increase in density. If you were to look at these spots later in the summer, you might find them suffering or dying due to the increased susceptibility to summer stress because of too much nitrogen. This concludes this presentation on self-thinning.